All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Kim. I am the moderator with Leslie, and it is my absolute honor to welcome you to the first session of the Military Writers Symposium on Irregular Warfare, a topic that has never been more relevant or more complex. Irregular warfare operates in the gray zones between peace and open conflict. It is a struggle for influence, legitimacy, and information, often without a single shot fired. It challenges how we think about deterrence, about war, about power, and about how nations compete and defend their interests in the modern era. In today's session, we are joined by two leading experts who approach these challenges from different but deeply connected perspectives: lawfare and gray zone tactics. To begin, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Jill Goldenziel. Dr. Goldenziel is a professor at the National Defense University's College of Information and Cyberspace, where she teaches senior military and civilian leaders from the United States and allied nations. She is also a non-resident fellow with NATO's Office of Legal Affairs at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, and an affiliated scholar at the University of Pennsylvania's Fox Leadership International Program. Her award-winning research explores international law, lawfare, and information warfare, examining how law itself has become a weapon in strategic competition. She is a Forbes and Bloomberg opinion columnist, has testified before Congress, and in 2022 received NATO's Serge Lazarev Prize for her groundbreaking work on legal operations and lawfare. Dr. Goldenziel's work reminds us that in today's conflict, ideas, norms, and narratives could be just as decisive as kinetic power, and that mastering the legal and informational battle space is essential to winning in the irregular one. Please note that Dr. Goldenziel is participating in her personal capacity. The views expressed in the presentation of her own does not necessarily represent those of her university, the U.S. Department of Defense, or any other arm of the U.S. government. At this point, I will turn it over to my co-moderator, who will introduce our second speaker.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Cadet Leslie Moline. I'm a criminology major here at Norwich University, and it is my privilege to introduce our second keynote speaker, Dr. Landgraf. Dr. Landgraf is the commentary editor at War on Rocks as a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute Eurasia's program and an adjunct professor at Rowan University. He previously served as a managing editor of the Texas National Security Review with a 20-year career in the U.S. Army. He has extensive overseas experience in the United Kingdom, the Republic of Georgia, Belgium, Afghanistan, and Iraq, along with tours at the Pentagon and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Dr. Landgraf holds a PhD from Virginia Tech's School of Public and International Affairs and is a leading voice in military strategy, foreign policy, and defense analysis. I would like to now invite Dr. Goldenziel to the podium.
Thank you to our moderators, and thank you to all of you for being here this morning. Your commandant was my first boss in professional military education 9 years ago, and for those of you who haven't had the chance to get to know him, do it while he's here. You will benefit greatly from his leadership and also his excellent sense of humor, which I needed when I was dropped into the Marine Corps unexpectedly 9 years ago. So I've been given 15 minutes to introduce to you the topic that has taken up most of my time for the last 5.5 years since I started writing on it seriously. So this is going to be a very quick wave-tops overview of lawfare, and I hope that you will be interested enough after this to dig into it more, ask lots of questions in the Q&A, and I'm always happy to follow up and talk about this. All right. So first, why does this matter? The US tends to be very focused on crisis. We're focused on responding to crisis. We're focused on the what if scenario if The PRC invades Taiwan. What if crisis breaks out in the Pacific or in the South China Sea? The PRC is very focused on the long term. They're very focused on creating a world that is safe for their interests, safe for authoritarianism, safe for them being able to do what they want in their neighborhood and all over the world. And these aggregate consequences over time that they're taking little actions towards each and every day can be as damaging as armed conflict in the long term. And lawfare is a key part of that strategy. Nothing less than the entire world-based international order is at stake. Freedom is at stake. Internet freedom, which I hope we'll have some time to talk about, is very much at stake. Free speech freedoms in the US are at stake from the PRC's actions in this domain. And yet, as I'll talk about, the US has not focused on this very much. That's starting to change, certainly very much in the last 5.5 years, and I've had the privilege of being involved in those efforts, but we're not nearly as focused on this domain as China is. How many of you had heard of lawfare before this morning? Okay. I hope next time I'm here in 5 or 10 years, all of those hands will go up. All right, so what is lawfare? The PRC has had 3 warfares, what's known as the 3 warfares, that underpin their military strategy since at least 1963. It may have been even before that. 1963 is the first time we can find it written down in Chinese doctrine. And these 3 warfares are meant to be used in tandem with each other to seed the groundwork for PRC strategy and PRC military actions. So they underpin the PRC's entire civil-military fusion strategy. So what are they? Public opinion warfare or media warfare involves shaping domestic and international public opinion with a specific goal of undermining the adversary's will to fight. Psychological warfare is about undermining the adversary's combat power and resolve with the specific goal of getting the adversary to factionalize. Then legal warfare, which is often translated as lawfare, is about shaping the global context for PRC's actions using domestic and international law. And the goal of legal warfare is to delegitimize the adversary. So if some of this looks familiar, that's because for 2 of the 3, the US military has some sort of analog. A little bit different, but we have information warfare, we have psychological warfare, we have PSYOPs, been doing those for a while. The goal might be a little bit different, the methods might be a little bit different, but we have rough analogs. We don't have anything like that for legal warfare. We don't have military operational specialties focused on it. We don't have all of our JAG or Judge Advocate Corps trained in it. And again, that's starting to change, but we're not there yet. And we certainly don't have commanders all trained in lawfare. So about 5 years ago, I wrote a law review article which got published in the Cornell Law Review. And then I started getting calls from military units, combatant commands saying, we're interested in your work, come advise us, help us develop programs on it. And the first one was US Indo-PACOM and the Joint Staff. There are now 3 combatant commands with counter-lawfare programs based on my work, and I advise them, and I'm working with a number of other combatant commands and units as well that I'd be happy to talk about. And so Indo-PACOM took my definition from this law review article, which is that lawfare is the purposeful use of law to achieve a particular objective, strategic, operational, or tactical, against a particular adversary, or to bolster the legitimacy of one's own strategy, operations, tactics, or weaken the legitimacy of an adversary's. So this is a bit of a mouthful. A colleague of mine wrote a book called Lawfare, Law as a Weapon of War. That's much more catchy. But my goal was to come up with something operationalizable. So to unpack this for a second, lawfare has to be a purposeful use of law. Not every law passed by Congress is lawfare. It has to be targeted against a particular adversary to be lawfare. It's how that law is used, not what that law necessarily says. And then this legitimacy piece is what's probably taken off the most in the joint force, because it turns out that the will to fight is really, really important, which some of you already know far better than I do. And undermining the will to fight, undermining the resolve of an adversary or the PRC's work to undermine their adversaries turns out to be extremely important. There are 5 types of lawfare that I've defined, which I'm going to walk you through in the next few slides. Battlefield exploitation, instrumental, information, institutional, and proxy. These are observational, which means that there are ways I've seen states using lawfare. There are other types. I'm giving these to you as a way of breaking down what could be an otherwise amorphous concept, right? Don't think too hard about, well, is that either battlefield exploitation or is that institutional? That's not the point. The point is just to be able to unpack this concept a bit more. And most of the references I give you are going to be with relevance to what's going on in the South China Sea. You can see the map here. China claims everything within that tongue-shaped, I'm seeing some people nodding, so I imagine you've seen this before, that tongue-shaped area, which they call the 9-dash line. You can see it superimposed over some gray dotted lines, which are the exclusive economic zones of those neighboring states according to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And you can see there's a lot of overlap there, and thus the possibility of some kind of conflict. Right. So first, battlefield exploitation lawfare. When this concept of lawfare was first brought into the legal academy by then Colonel, later Major General Charlie Dunlap, back in 2001. I imagine our Marine generals worked with him, and perhaps your commandant as well, has worked with him in the Middle East when he was Mattis's JAG in CENTCOM. So when he brought this concept into the academy back in 2001, he talked about how violent non-state actors were using human shields against US and coalition forces, and of course Hamas using them against Israel as well. So adversaries were exploiting the law-abidingness of US and coalition forces. Right? That's the classic conception of lawfare. That's what battlefield exploitation lawfare is. What China is doing here is they're using the People's Armed Forces maritime militia to blur that line between combatant and civilian. These are civilian fishing vessels, civilian fishing fleets manned by civilians that are under PRC military command part of the time, making it difficult for other forces, US forces, to know whether these are actually fishermen fishing or whether they're engaged in some kind of military activity for the PRC. And it's unclear what exactly that then would mean in armed conflict, certainly unclear what that means for their targetability during gray zone warfare. And it creates an information operations debacle no matter what, because if a US military vessel were to fire on a fishing vessel per se, even if they're actually under the Chinese chain of command, it's going to look like the US is firing on a civilian vessel. Instrumental lawfare is the use of law to achieve a traditional military objective. And this is my favorite one because of the Philippines-China arbitration. So up here, what looks like a pile of rocks is a picture of Scarborough Shoal, which has been in the news recently as well. Back in 2012, there was a major standoff there between between Philippine and PRC military vessels. And the US at the time said, or was ambiguous at best, as to whether we would come to the aid of the Philippines if they got involved in military conflict with the PRC at Scarborough Shoal. At the same time, China was building artificial islands, and you can see up here, this is 2012, Mischief Reef in the Philippines Exclusive Economic Zone. 3 years later, what it looked like, and that picture from 2017, where you can see that it has been militarized, although Xi Jinping was denying that at the time. So what did the Philippines do? Because they couldn't fight back militarily. They filed a lawsuit, which they eventually won in 2016 in the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And that decision has now set the lines for any coming conflict in the South China Sea. The allies of the Philippines have said that, have urged the PRC to comply with Unconventional law of the sea boundaries and the terms of the International Court arbitration, whereas China has angrily rejected it. This decision has made China extremely angry and caused them to really advance their own legal warfare claims as well. And here's one of the ways: information lawfare, by using law to control the narrative of the conflict. China rejected the arbitration as what they call a piece of waste paper and has started creating their own legal narrative through what I'll call creative interpretations of the Unconventional law of the sea. Immediately after the decision, they put up this, I'll call it a billboard in Times Square on this building here, and broadcast 5 times a day for about 6 weeks following the arbitration a video telling their side of the story, how China has ruled the South China Sea peacefully for centuries, and then an unnamed intruder came into their backyard and started causing all kinds of problems. And they did it here in Times Square in order to put a thumb in the US's eye, but also to broadcast their narrative to as many foreign tourists as possible. And I would encourage you to look up this video on YouTube. It is almost hilarious in its distortions of the facts, but also a bit scary because you know that a lot of people are also listening and believing this narrative, especially if it's the first one that they hear. Institutional lawfare, creating new laws and institutions to support military or strategic efforts. So sometimes China does this very literally. They have created Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank in order to fund their Belt and Road projects, and they've gotten a lot of the US allies and partners involved in these banks as well. They've also created a number of domestic laws known as the Legal Great Wall in order to ostensibly protect their national security and cybersecurity. There's about 20 of those laws, depending on who you ask. One of them is the Coast Guard, an amendment to the Chinese Coast Guard law, which enables the Chinese Coast Guard to operate far off the coast of mainland China, including in the exclusive economic zones of all of its neighbors, especially the Philippines. And then proxy lawfare. How many of you have heard of TikTok? Thought so, a lot more than I've heard of lawfare. So I probably don't need to explain to you or talk to you very much about the litigation that has gone on between TikTok and the United States. And of course, the US isn't really worried about TikTok, the company per se. What we're really worried about is the influence of the People's Republic of China. And when I testified before Congress, I talked all about other legal actions that Chinese proxies are taking, not only in our courts, but in the courts of our allies and partners as well. So what I want you to come away with is that the PRC is using these 3 warfares, legal warfare, but certainly in tandem with information warfare and psychological warfare, to manifest its own narrative over the long term. And I use manifest because China's view very much is if we say the world is like this, it will eventually become that way. And many of our allies and partners are hearing China's narrative first, right? They don't know, and it's not because our allies and partners are like, stupid by any means. It's not that. It's that China has infiltrated the information infrastructure of various countries, and they're loud enough that they're able to broadcast their narrative in ways that right now that we don't. And if they start to hear China's creative legal interpretations, China's interpretations of how the world should be, China's depiction of the US as an evil intruder in their backyard, people are going to start to believe it. There's a risk there, big risk there. People are going to start to believe it. And the US has been late to the game at catching on to this. Again, we're moving forward, but we have a long way to go to catch up. Since many of you are focused on cyber and information, I'll leave you with what I'm really worried about at night, which is that China is really trying to push its own technological standards, right? And those technological standards really affect the way that we use the internet. So if you imagine, many of you probably grew up with the internet, so you don't remember when you first opened your own web browser. But imagine that you're opening Weibo instead of Google, right? What wouldn't you know? You wouldn't know anything about Tiananmen Square. You wouldn't know anything about Hong Kong once being relatively free. You wouldn't know that Taiwan has been independent and never ruled by China, right? And they're trying to do the same thing with DeepSeek versus US models of AI. If DeepSeek becomes the AI platform or the LLM that the world runs on, they're going to start to see a very different narrative than the US narrative of what the world should look like and what international law should look like. And so I leave it to you to solve that problem in your future careers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goldenseal. At this time, I would like to invite Dr. Landgraf for his talk on gray zone tactics. Let's give him a round of applause.
Good morning, everyone. This is my first time at Norwich University, and really appreciate the honor of coming here to speak with you all today. Thank you, leaders, administrators, our student moderators, students, and cadets. I learned just last night that Norwich is the home of ROTC, which is a pretty cool honor. Myself and a product of ROTC being commissioned into the Army in 2003 as an intelligence officer. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about a different U.S. adversary using gray zone tactics. And then I'm going to shift to talk about writing. After all, this is a military writer symposium, and I know in your studies you're engaged with writing, and as you graduate and either join the military or go onwards to other leadership positions, you'll be asked to write as well. And it's important that we try to write clearly and communicate effectively. So I'll talk a bit about Russia's air incursions in European NATO territory, a recent spate of incidents over the past 30 to 60 days. And then I'll also talk about writing and editing and leave you with some tips on improving your writing. So I'm an editor at War on the Rocks, which is a digital media outlet. We focus on defense, foreign affairs, and national security. What does an editor do? An editor basically works with a writer to try to make your publication as best as possible, to get your writing in the best fighting shape so it reaches a wide audience and is easily accessible to an audience. There's been a debate unfolding in our pages at War on the Rocks over the past 30 to 60 days surrounding this series of Russian air incursions over European NATO territory. This is both through drones and then also manned fighters. There's been incidents over Poland, Romania, and Estonia, and other places throughout September and into October. And so the first question is, why now? And what is the point of these air incursions? And it points to a couple different ways to think about it. One is that this is a gray zone tactic, employing unconventional means in a vague no man's land between war and peace. Actions that can be seen as aggressive and provocative, but are also below the threshold of armed conflict. And so what these things do, drone incidents, overflight incidents, they're able to avoid unpredictable escalation dynamics and how conflicts could escalate from gray zone to outright war. It creates confusion on how countries and alliances such as NATO can react and respond to these incidents. It also is a punitive measure. These incidents are also meant to send a message to those countries who are supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia to stop doing so or to reconsider supporting Ukraine. And on another level, it's probing NATO's responses, not only the air defense responses of NATO countries, but the political response and the element of political cohesion and alliance cohesion that is implicated in these responses. So these events raise a lot of questions. One is how to understand these things and how to understand the incidents of the last 30 to 60 days. Some observers interpret these as a first step to the road to war, a prelude in a series of actions that Russia will take to escalate into all-out war with Europe. Another way to look at these incidents is that this is a continuum of events that Russia has been engaged in since the initial invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea in 2014, but has really ratcheted up since the full-scale invasion of in 2022. And this is not just air incursions, overflights of NATO territory. This is espionage, cyber attacks, sabotage attacks, arson across Europe. So there's really multiple ways to interpret how these things are happening, and how we interpret these actions shapes how our responses will be to these actions. So how should NATO and the United States respond to these events? And there's really three options here. Some observers say that NATO should, quote unquote, defend forward. So instead of defending from behind NATO's borders, using defensive measures, air defense measures, NATO should do more to defend from inside Ukraine. Now, whether that means stationing NATO personnel and NATO systems on Ukrainian territory is an interesting question, and it has a lot of implications and consequences. The most dire is that it could lead to direct war between NATO and Russia. Other observers say that these incidents justify giving Ukraine more capability to defend itself. So whether either providing more weapons, more training, more systems to the Ukrainians so the Ukrainians can defend themselves and their territory. And then there's always the option in any military courses of action is to do nothing. Do nothing is sometimes a reasonable option to gather more facts, to observe, see how events will play out. But in this case, do nothing could mean that Russian incursions continue and resulting in death in a frontline state, and that will very may well implicate NATO's Article 5, which is the bedrock of the NATO Charter that states that an attack on one country means an attack on all, and that NATO countries will respond to defend each other. So, as an editor at War on the Rocks, I have the responsibility and really the honor, because this is a research subject that's very close to my heart, NATO and transatlantic relations, is to be able to shape and cultivate these debates on our pages. So let me turn now to writing. So why should you write? You have to write quite a bit as a student in your essays and finals. Once you move on from Norwich, you may say to yourselves that you're finished writing. You're a bit sick of it. It's time to move on. But the fact is, many of you are going to be placed in leadership positions, whether they're in the military or in the private sector or working for the government. And leaders need to be good communicators. There's really no way around that. And writing helps you become a better communicator. Writing helps you share lessons learned. It broadens and widens your reach to a larger audience. And writing also helps you learn faster by identifying your own unforeseen gaps in your own knowledge. By putting pen to paper, you get a better sense of understanding of where your own gaps are and ways to fill those gaps. And it doesn't really matter who you are. Everyone has ideas that someone else can benefit from. So it's worth sharing those ideas. So you may ask yourself, well, I'm just starting out, I'm inexperienced. What should I write about? And as you move into, for some of you joining the military, moving into your first duty stations, duty positions as lieutenants, you should write what you know. Every author is an expert in something. So find that something and leverage your experience with the subject or the unique perspective that you have on it. Doing so will enhance your chance of having your writing accepted at a publication, because an editor reviewing your work will inevitably look at your biography. And that's another tip. If you're looking to publish your work somewhere, even if an outlet doesn't ask for it, send in a biography, send in your resume. And the implied task there is to ensure that you have a resume and to keep it updated. Because that lived experience gives you that natural credibility. Written by someone with experience will be apparent when you submit something for publication. And that credibility that you have from that lived experience, it lends itself to a more well-crafted, engaging, and personalized narrative. As far as how to get started, how to put pen to paper, how to start writing and making writing a habit. And I'll offer a few ideas on how you can do this. As you move, many of you will be commissioned, going off into the military, serving in your first duty position 2-3 years at a time, and then moving on to another place. That end of the tour time is a great opportunity for capstone writing. And what I mean by that is writing and reflecting at the end of a particular duty position. Share what you learned, share what you failed at, and share what you wish you had done differently. A good way to get into writing is branch journals. The Army, in the last couple of years, has started an initiative called the Harding Project to revitalize professional military writing. The kind of cornerstone to that is branch-specific journals. And this is a great way for young leaders to get involved in shaping the future of their branches, whether it's armor, infantry, intelligence, cyber. Find that branch-specific challenge to address, such as integrating first-person view drones into ground operations, and write on how that can be fixed. Another way is to address institutional issues. As you go off and you start your professional military education, share lessons learned on how PME can be improved, how it can be changed, how it can be adapted, because it's constantly adapting. And by doing so, you can start a dialogue between the institution, the learning institution, and the fielded force. And lastly, organizational. And I'm talking about your specific units here. What can your units be doing to make training more effective and preparing for combat? Write these in a white paper and seek publication to help other outside your organization and broaden your reach. And so in closing, before we get to the Q&A, I think what's most important is that you just put pen to paper and start writing. And look to publish your work. At War in the Rocks, we end up rejecting really about 90% of submissions. But writing what you know about, writing that you have, stuff that you've experienced in, will help you seek publication and help you succeed. But writing takes practice, and through practice and repetition and sets, you'll build competence and confidence needed to find success in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Landgraf. We'll now open the floor for questions. As we move into the Q&A session, I would like to remind everyone to please keep your questions brief and focused so we can hear from as many of you as possible before we wrap up. If you would like to direct your question to a specific speaker, please mention that at the start. Otherwise, we'll let either of them jump in. The microphones for the questions are on both sides of the auditorium for the students and for anyone to come up for your questions. Thank you.
My name is Forrester Bellinger. Dr. Goldstein. The U.S. has been hesitant to sign into a lot of larger legal frameworks like the ICC, as well as other kind of conventions on warfare. Has that helped or has that hurt us in the law war setting?
Thank you for that question. I think overall, the U.S.'s reluctance to engage with international law has hurt us. I think it's very much hurt us in the case of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which we've famously not ratified, but follow as a matter of customary international law, because China likes to throw that in our face and say, well, the US hasn't even signed on, we have, so we have greater moral authority, and that's not true. So I think it's, in that area, it's particularly hurt us. The reluctance to engage with international law in general is, I think, very much a political issue, but also comes from the idea that somehow international law is going to supersede US law, or that the US is going to be held liable in international courts. And I like to say, well, we have the best lawyers in the world. I've been fortunate enough to train some of them, but I think it's just fact that so many foreign lawyers come to our law schools and choose to participate and file suit in our legal system when they can, because our justice system is the envy of the world and our law schools are so good. So why don't we give that a shot and engage with the international community and believe in our own people to win? My caveat to that is the International Criminal Court. And my views on this have changed in the last 9 years since teaching in professional military education. Because as a simple fact, the US is engaged in the most wars in the world, and mistakes happen that can look like crimes, but are not necessarily crimes. So there is a real, I think, legitimate concern that U.S. service members could be hauled before the International Criminal Court in larger numbers than perhaps we deserve. Now, the counter to that, and I'm very conflicted about this in my own views, is that the International Criminal Court operates on what's known as the principle of complementarity, which means it's only supposed to step in when a domestic legal system cannot handle a particular case. So again, if we have the best justice system in the world, it should be able to protect our service members. The UCMJ and the system that supports it is pretty strong. So that's an area in which I say I have not come to a final decision on, but I think it does hurt our international credibility to some extent not to be involved in that institution.
Operations, as well as for creating a narrative around NATO circling another.
Sorry, your question was how Russia's using lawfare? Well, I think there's similarities between the two cases in what China's doing, let's say in the South China Sea, and what Russia's doing in Eastern NATO territory. But with doing these actions below the threshold of conventional war, we also need to keep in mind that these are two distinct geopolitical contexts, and geography matters and place matters. U.S. alliance structures matter. The U.S. alliance structure in the Indo-Pacific is bilateral based. The United States has a series of bilateral treaties. It's not that way in Europe. Obviously, NATO is an alliance of 32 countries, and Article 5, Article 5 is an interesting thing because a lot of people mistake it that if one NATO member is attacked, then all other NATO members must respond militarily. But it's not that. How a country responds is a national decision, and it was made that way deliberately in the NATO Charter. So there is a degree of ambiguity and vagueness itself in NATO's own charter, because Article 5 has only been triggered once, and this was after September 11th, and each country did respond to defend the United States, but how each country responded varied quite a bit. So there is, vagueness on all sides, and I think that is a better reason for restraint and observation, and to continued communication and engagement with allies to keep up NATO cohesion and political alignment.
Good morning, sir. My name is Cadet Hernandez, an Army cadet. I wanted to direct a question regarding your mention of gray zone tactics, which I found very compelling. Given the fact that the Army has expanded into multi-domain warfare over the last couple of years especially, and in its pivot to near-peer conflict, I was wondering, given these new domains, these emerging technologies which oftentimes merge the liminality between domains. What do you anticipate the future of large-scale combat operations look like between near-peer threats in the United States? And how do gray zone tactics play into it, given the fact that, as you described, gray zone tactics are meant to sort of straddle the line between warfare while still meeting strategic ends?
I think you're seeing possibilities of how the future warfare will play out. You know, the Army talks about multi-domain operations. As far as I know, most wars do take place in multiple domains. Maybe not all domains, but they do take place in multiple domains. I think what you will see as far as the Army is concerned is a continued working with allies and partners and helping to address those threats in ways to leverage allied partner capabilities in both Indo-Pacific and in European theaters.
Thank you, sir.
We have about a minute left remaining, so if we can keep this question under a minute, we would still like to take the question.
Good morning, Dr. Goldenseal. I have a question specifically regarding lawfare and its interaction with cultural differences. The idea of accountability differs very differently depending on your population. So how do you connect with a country that doesn't necessarily value accountability, such as the PRC? They don't value their own domestic law and following it. So how do you use lawfare against a country such as that?
Great question. So international law sets standards for accountability that may be different than the standards of accountability in a domestic legal system. The PRC will, of course, push back against that. So the example I'll give is the South China Sea arbitration, which I was talking about before, which is the other name for the Philippines-China arbitration. The PRC rejects the decision as illegitimate under international law because they said the Philippines didn't try hard enough to negotiate. And what the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea says is that states are supposed to negotiate before going to an international tribunal. It doesn't say how long the states are supposed to negotiate for, what sufficient negotiation is. So in that sense, the PRC has a point, but the Philippines would say that they tried and the negotiations didn't get anywhere. And China's position has always been that countries need to resolve these disputes bilaterally, and which is a negotiation in which they would always have the upper hand with their neighbors because of their comparative military power. And so they prefer bilateral negotiations to any sort of resort to international courts. But the standard is there. The treaty has been signed. The parties to the treaty are supposed to accept international decisions as final once they are once the court has made a decision. They're supposed to participate in an arbitration. China chose not to participate in that arbitration, which is unfortunately something we don't have time to get into. So they have signed on to a standard that they are now straining to make arguments for why they didn't accept. And the people or the body that holds them accountable is the international community. That's how international law gets enforced, by the international community, whether that's militarily, whether that's reputationally, whether that's because of trade arrangements, et cetera, which we could hold a class on that in itself, but we don't have time. So in some sense, the PRC standard of accountability matters, but what really matters is how the international community then holds China to account and how the international community interprets accountability under international law.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to close our first session by thanking both of our speakers, Dr. Godenseel and Dr. Landgraf, for helping us understand and preserve both national and international security, lawfare, and gray zone tactics. At this time, for those who still have questions, I would encourage you to stay and ask the speakers here at the front of the stage while being mindful of those leaving and entering from classes. With that, I'd like to officially close this panel. Thank you once again, and I look forward to seeing how these ideas continue to shape the discourse at the Military Advisor Symposium and at our futures. Thank you.